Are we ready?
We're fucking ready.
All right. Greetings, listeners of ill repute. I feel like we should give them a name, like greetings, liabilities. greetings, different.
Much better than anything else. Hey, fuckos.
Greetings, liabilities. Greetings, ill reputations. I like liabilities. Greetings, my future liabilities.
Hi, potential witnesses later down the line.
Yeah.
I'm very likable. Nobody would have ever suspected it was me because I'm so sweet and kind and neighborly.
Yes.
You too, right?
Yeah, just like everyone else. I'm actually working on a one-woman show called Likeable that is which is based on when I sold my show to the streaming platform that will not be named. They bought it, and then in the first development meeting, they said, and I'm paraphrasing,
Mm-hmm.
but they were like, we love it. It's so honest. It's so real. The lead character, the show's based on me. I am the lead character.
Yes.
The lead character, like, you know, it's like she's such a scumbag. Like, is there a way to just like make her a little more likable? And I was like, well, if I knew how to do that, I would be sitting in a suit behind a desk at a major streaming platform calling all the shots, wouldn't I? Like, actually, do you have a brochure? Can you actually outline how you got where you are? Because if I knew
your job one day.
Yeah. Like, all right. Welcome to Ill Repute, the podcast where we support women's rights, but more importantly, we support women's wrongs.
Yes, the fuck we do. And Savi, baby, ever since our first recording, when you said that has lived, I wouldn't say it lived rent-free in my brain because I pay rent on it every day because I don't want to be evicted from that thought. I love it. And I will fucking, like, I called USAA and I was like, I need renter's insurance on this fucking idea. Talk to software. I don't know. You're the insurance agent. I don't know how this fucking works. Jesus. Like,
So who are you, Ella Darling?
I'm Ella Darling. I'm a sex worker. I am a porn performer. I am an amateur roboticist. I am a
Virtual reality pioneer.
I'm the world's first virtual reality cam girl.
Yes.
And I have some trophies in my bedroom that say, we're so proud of you because you did porn and then you did literally anything else. And we're so impressed that you were able to literally function outside of a set where you're being filled with all of your holes. Baby girl, you made it.
Yeah. In addition to being a pincushion, you also built a machine to get you out of porn. You also have some degrees in like forensic psychology and library science. So you also are a little smarty pants person.
Who's fucking talking, man?
Like, I've dabbled in the I'm a recovering academic. I'm sovereign sire.
Graduate school extensively.
Yes.
Like it's cool. No, you don't have to preface anything that you do with your accolades because like people who do that, like, okay, babe, if it was true, we'd know. And
I'm a recovering braggart. I'm a recovering narcissistic adjacent person. I'm sovereign sire. I am a former sex worker and a screenwriter and a stand-up comedian, as well as racking up a few degrees in sociology and English lit and some grad school training in creative nonfiction and some minor studies in American studies. So that kind of qualifies me slightly to have perspectives.
You were a professor. You taught classes.
I did not have a PhD. I was not a professor. But
I didn't say that you had a PhD. I'm saying you taught fucking college. I did learn from you. I learned from you.
I did. And you know what's funny is I still occasionally hear from students that took English 1 from me, and it is always kind of a laugh riot. So I had a lasting impact. Usually they reach out to me when they've seen my pornography of women. My pornographs. Yeah. So that's who we are. This podcast is Ill Repute, where we profile the lives of women, both famous and exceptional and notorious and criminal, whether they were pioneering their industries or they were just fleecing millions. We celebrate them all. We dissect them all.
Queen.
Yes. There are many ways to be a boss. Today, we're jumping into part 2 of our episode on Sarah Baartman. So if you haven't listened to part 1, go listen to that because you're going to need all of that context.
Yeah, we recorded it for a reason.
Yeah, so go back and listen to that. And with that, we will start part 2. So where we last left off, we were describing how Sarah Baartman's performances went and what the show looked like. And so to recap, I'll just read the last kind of paragraph. And this comes from The African Queen, The Real Life of the Hottentot Venus by Rachel Holmes. All right,
Excellent.
back up. So this is sort of the last paragraph from the previous episode. It ends with Sarah's debut, as it were. To the audience that gazed up curiously at Sarky, Venus was simply a synonym for sex. To behold the figure of Venus or to hear her name was to be prompted to think about lust or love. At the same time, the word Hottentot signified all that was strange, disturbing, alien, and possibly sexually deviant. Some, especially the elite viewers, had heard travelers' tales of mysterious Hottentot women reputed to have enormous buttocks and strangely elongated labia, and to smoke a great deal. And here she was, a fantasy made flesh, tinted gold by the stage light, elevated above them, uniting the full imaginary force of these two powerful words, Hottentot and Venus. Her skin-tight, skin-colored body stocking clung to her so snugly that it was plain for all to see that she wore no corset, stockings, or drawers beneath. Most shockingly, the luminous ropes of ivory-colored ostrich eggshell beads that cascaded from her neck to her waist failed entirely to conceal her nipples, visible through the thin, silken fabric.
She was a hit. On Sundays, she would be taken in a carriage ride around Picadilly Square as a kind of advertisement. It's worthwhile to mention here that carriage rides around the square were also a popular way for courtesans and other sex workers to advertise themselves. While it's not documented anywhere, it's entirely possible that Sarah was also engaging in sex work at the behest of her masters, Dunlop and Caesar. She got to have private audiences with nobility and celebrities. Even if she was in bondage, there were probably moments of exhilaration and joy in the midst of it all. She was 22 years old, performing on stage at night, being celebrated in posters and songs and poems, meeting nobles and actors and intellectuals. She became, by most contemporary accounts, an overnight celebrity. Cartoons and poems were written about her, and eventually a play. A popular poem went as follows. Though Venus of old, by records we're told, excited the praise of mankind, our Hottentot still will not leave her equal behind. I don't feel like I read that correctly, or it's a bad poem.
You did. Though Venus of old, by records we're told, excited the praise of mankind, our Hottentot still will not leave her equal behind, which is a reference to her enormous ass. It is a poem in praise of her backside.
Yes.
Which
Philippian, the word?
Yes. But this reminds me of the famous joke, why did the chicken cross the road to get to the other side? Most people don't realize that's a double entendre, right?
I did not know that.
The other side is heaven, right? The other side. So why did the chicken cross the road to get to the other side, to get to heaven? And I just made a TikTok today talking about, so what you're saying is Lil Wayne wrote the first joke ever because that's exactly his turn of phrase. Like, why did the chicken cross the road to get to the other side? Bitches lining up, dying to lie, right? Like it's exactly the kind of like turn of phrase that Lil Wayne uses in his raps. And this poem also reminds me of like a Lil Wayne thing where it's all about double entendre. So our Hottentot still will not leave her equal behind means no one will compare to her, but also it's a reference to her ass and it's the gloriousness of her backside.
Her glorious glutes.
Yes.
And
So
accompanied in our script is an image of her. Do you mind if I describe it?
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's an illustration of Sarky. It says, it's just Sarky the Hottentot Venus. She is much as Sovereign described earlier. It looks like There's beads, but they're actually around her waist. So maybe kind of those same beads are kind of draping down over her genitalia. She's 3/4 pointed away from the camera. So we see her ass and we see her back. We see a side view of a breast that looks to be covered because I don't see a nipple. And there is some kind of bra going on that looks incredibly like 2019 in the fact that it's kind of strappy and weird. It looks like she probably got ripped off on Amazon for that one. She's wearing some sort of like, it looks like a headband or perhaps like a bandana or something. I don't know exactly what it is. And she's got this incredibly beautiful cloak draped over the shoulder on the far side from where we see. And it looks like a really beautiful like fur cloak. She's also holding in her hand a very large pole, and I'm not sure what that's supposed to be.
If you go look up on Google and you do an image search for Khoisan people, you can see it's like a similar thing. There's a beaded headband. There's a lot of beadwork and beads worn. And instead of being fully nude, they put her in a nude body stocking. So she was technically dressed, but they were trying to impart as much as possible how you would see an Indigenous person at that time if you were in South Africa, what the traditional dress would be. I found other images of Hottentot and they would picture women in like skirts and tunics, but almost all of them, they're always smoking a corncob pipe. So that also was part of the cultural mystique. Smoking for women was not acceptable until the 1920s, just to situate you with where that is. That's its whole own episode. It has to do with Edward Bernays and Torches of Freedom and blue stockings in the 1920s and the New York, I think it was the Macy's Day Parade. That's another episode. Women smoking was not even remotely acceptable for like another 100 years. But culturally within the Khoisan, clearly that was a part of the thing. We're going to see that there's a lot about her presentation beyond the body or the implied nudity. There's a lot about her that really bucks traditional gender roles in very laced up England. We're not even in the Victorian era. I mean, we're still in like the 1810s, the 1820s. We're at the tail end of the Enlightenment at this time. 2 weeks into her performance, she caught the flu. She was performing while sick, and people started to question her treatment. In one performance, Caesar lifted his bamboo cane threateningly at her, and she complied with the performance, which made people sure that she was being beaten in private. In another instance, a man laughed at her while she was playing her guitar, and she attacked him with it. This was rolled into her branding by her masters, who capitalized on her wild nature when really she was just exhausted. Abolitionists started to write about her conditions. She was seen as a slave. The branding of her as a wild beast to be contained both appealed to the conceit of the show, a wild beauty from the quote-unquote dark continent of Africa, but also appealed to the compassion of people that felt slavery was shameful. England at this time had about 20,000 free Black citizens. It was a country that was already multi-ethnic. An abolitionist named Zachary Macaulay went to see Sarah and wrote a letter to the paper about her treatment, seeing her as a Black female slave being exploited by her master for public display in the heart of London where slavery was illegal. He called into question how she had been transported to England and whether or not she was willing and freely putting herself on display or whether she was being detained and wished to return home. He wrote to the Examiner the following.
To a contemplative and feeling man, few things are so painful as to behold the degradation of his species. Under whatever disguise the spectacle may be veiled, whether as an object of science or natural research, it, quote, is nevertheless a disgusting, afflictive, and mortifying sight. It's really nice to hear someone put that perspective to paper.
What a lot of people don't realize is that slavery was never 100% accepted by people. From the beginning of slavery, there were people challenging slavery. One of them was one of the missionaries that was on the ships with Columbus when he reached the Americas. And he came back and was so mortified by what he had seen that he got an audience with the Pope and was part of a huge debate over whether or not slavery was in fact, moral or Christian. There was always pushback against slavery. It has never been universally accepted. But a myth, especially in the United States, that we tell ourselves is that nobody realized it was bad until magically one day in 1860 or something. And that's just not true. It was always it was something that people were very ambivalent about. This is not surprising. I thought this was interesting just because people talk about social media, but social media has actually kind of always existed. It's just changed forms. And so writing to the paper an open letter would be kind of the equivalent of a Twitter post going, this is awful. It was a way that people would communicate with each other and debate these kinds of ideas. This abolitionist goes to the show and then writes to the paper. There was a back and forth where then Sarah's handlers wrote responses defending their position and defending that she was a free and willing person. So I'll continue. So Macaulay,
not her voice there though. Not that would have been a common thing, but
they do eventually talk to her. She becomes the first test case of abolition, actually, which is kind of what makes her exceptional, among many other things. Okay. So Macaulay was also a member of the Society for the Suppression of Vice, of course. Do you know what vice is?
You know what? I don't know that I could give you the dictionary definition, but a vice is essentially the way that something that you do to blow off a little steam. It might not be something that your gods approve of, or the people who pretend that they're advocates of your gods, but it's fun and feels good and blows off a little steam. And you just sometimes need to do some shit so that you can get back to a centered place of balance. And that's how I pay my rent.
Well, spoken like a real sex criminal. Vice. So vice is generally when you have the Society for the Suppression of Vice, you have a vice squad on modern police squads. Vice squads tend to deal with crimes that we would call victimless crimes of morality. So chiefly a vice squad is someone that is investigating prostitution, that is investigating gambling.
Would you say ATF is vice?
No, vice. I mean, I'm sure there's all of those things are sort of interlinked, but usually vice squad is dealing with sex work and gambling operations. That's generally, which are seen as they're sort of victimless crimes, and then to a degree, drug trafficking. They're moral crimes. We don't think people should do those things. We don't think they should do drugs. We don't think they should engage in sex work. We don't think they should gamble. But they're sort of victimless in the sense that you're victimizing yourself would be the argument of a vice person is there, you know what I mean? But there's not a kind of an obvious victim.
I experience this almost every day. Not every day, but there's entire organizations that exist to insist that my entire career is actually violence against me as an individual, and that I need to be saved from my own autonomy and agency.
And that's going to become very chief in the story of Sarah Baartman, because as she stands now, there are people that view her as a helpless victim that was being trafficked. But when I read her story as someone that has a history in sex work, I come to it with a slightly different point of view. And we'll get into that as we get into what happens here. So Macaulay was also a member of the Society for the Suppression of Vice. He was the editor of the Christian Observer and was against dance, theater, and reading. He was not objecting just to her enslaved status, but to the wanton display of her sexuality. So he was more likely to be upset by the fact that he was turned on by what he was seeing than anything else. And most likely thought
everything I said. He sounds like a piece of shit. He didn't give a shit. He's just really upset that he has a weird boner that he's not sure how to explain. Tales little time, not cool anymore.
Yeah.
Save a hoe. Get out of here.
And most likely thought saving her would involve putting her into a church institution. Now, I thought this was a great point for us to talk about the rescue industry. As to hoes.
So yes.
As to hoes. What a lot of people don't know is a lot of what they call diversion programs is where they arrest a sex worker. And if she claims that she was trafficked, she can avoid prosecution. But she usually has to agree to go into a diversion program. Most of these diversion programs are religiously run organizations where the women are put into halfway houses where sometimes the doors are locked, the windows are screwed down, and they're forced to engage in essentially slave labor, either proselytizing, making crafts, cleaning, doing laundry, etc., in order to avoid prosecution. There have been reports of people losing custody of their children, not having access to cell phones, being literally locked into sweatshop conditions. This just goes to show this is sort of an age-old institution. Sex work and trafficking is seen as very low-hanging fruit. People will snatch it up. And, well, who would be opposed to trafficking? And if you make everything trafficking, it makes it a lot easier to get money and raise money. And the thing is, these women that are put in sweatshop conditions as part of diversion programs don't see any of that money. And they're also subsidized by the government. So they get a ton of money from the government to run these programs. And then they turn around and use the sex workers in the diversion program as unpaid labor. So they make money twice over. And no one questions it because when God is on your side, who cares if you're getting fucked in the deal?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and there's a lot of people who support these initiatives out of a sense of like, maybe they're ignorant and they just don't understand. They think that they want the best for sex workers, but they think they want the best for us because they see us as unfettered victims. It's almost par for the course. People who are trying to save us from ourselves. We use the phrase Captain Save-A-Ho because it's tongue in cheek. It gets to the point where so many people are trying to save you from your own work when you're a sex worker that you have to make light of it. So they're going into these like halfway houses. It's slave labor and everything. And that reminded me, before you even open it up for discussion, I was thinking about how many men contact sex workers because they just found us. They're not that kind of guy. They just came across us. They would never masturbate to. They've never seen their content.
Well,
they just are so concerned. I don't know why so many people try to save me from this work. I wish someone had said a goddamn thing when I was being taken advantage of as a laborer under any other job that I worked that nobody gave a shit about because my pussy wasn't visible at the time.
Yeah. Well, the largest click-through rate on sexual and pornographic links are Christian men. And the largest group of men that claim they're addicted to porn are Christian men. And what they found out is the more that you have moral objections to pornography, the more likely you are to consider yourself an addict of porn, no matter how little porn you watch. Which so it really skews the numbers. Yeah.
Like you said, a big part of it is one of the most decisive factors, like you said, is religiosity.
Yes.
Because people who don't care if God and other Christians are mad that they're spanking it don't feel bad about watching porn and jerking off because it's a human experience. And it's just like, I just want to address the concept of porn addiction real quick.
It's not real.
It's not real. It's not an addiction and it's not a thing. And you might say, but yeah, it is. And addiction is a chemical addiction in your brain. And that's
I've never met a single person that overdosed from porn.
You can't do that. And on the other side of that, like, well, what about gambling addiction? Because they're both neither of them are chemical. It's not the same as being addicted to heroin, technically, even though some real dipshits.
Even
porn, basically heroin. It's like, no, it's fucking not.
Even there, no one's ever lost their home or their life savings to porn. You couldn't buy enough porn to lose your house. You couldn't do it. So even there, you can't compare it to gambling addiction because you can't financially devastate yourself by watching porn.
Furthermore, gambling addiction is actually recognized under the DSM-5 as a psychological issue. Porn addiction isn't, and it decisively isn't, and they are vocal about why it's not. So if you think you have a porn addiction, you probably don't. And probably the problem is God and religion. And I'm so sorry to break it to you, but pussy's not the problem. Pussy's the solution.
Yeah. You probably need to look at your moral relationship. The abolitionists saw her as being an extension of sexual tourism. This resulted in back and forth fighting in papers between Dunlop and Macaulay. Eventually, it would end up in court. The first case about illegal slavery in England since abolition a few years prior. Rather than deterring audiences, this public argument between Dunlop, Caesar, and Macaulay made Sarah even more famous or notorious, depending. The abolitionists filed a writ of habeas corpus against Sarah's handlers. They cited that spectators were encouraged to touch her backside to assure it was real, and that she was dressed so as to appear naked. They wanted proof she had permission to leave South Africa and that she was, in fact, a servant and not a slave. Dunlop took her to an attorney that spoke Dutch and had him write up a contract and backdate it so that it showed that Dunlop was now in charge of her and not Caesar after the incident where Caesar had threatened her with a cane. It also stipulated her pay and that she get warmer clothes, her only complaint. They even offered up to create a trust for her earnings to be dispersed by the African Institute, the abolitionist organization bringing the suit against Dunlop and Caesar.
They wanted to create a trust for her earnings to be dispersed by an organization that was not her. Like
so basically, there's this back and forth debate going on in the papers where like, she's a slave. We want to see this and that. So Dunlop, who was the surgeon, and then Caesar, who was technically her actual employer. So Caesar was the free black man that had been Dunlop's manservant. After the incident where Peter Caesar had raised a cane at her publicly, that caused people to be upset. So Dunlop takes her to an attorney that speaks Dutch, which is a language that Sarah speaks. She speaks her native language, Dutch, and Afrikaans. So they're in Europe. So he takes her to a lawyer that speaks Dutch, right? So that he can talk to her.
Yes.
He drafts up a contract that stipulates exactly what her earnings are. The only complaint that she has at this point is that she doesn't have warmer clothes because they're in England. Yeah. It's very cold. So they draft up the contract that stipulates her pay, that stipulates she gets warmer clothes, etc. And to do one extra, Dunlop says, we'll even set up a trust for her. Well, all her earnings will go into a trust that the African Institute can be in control of and disperse it. So you can be especially assured that she is getting all of her money. Like, I won't even be touching it. You guys will be in charge of it. Like, I won't even be in charge of it.
So that was about giving this organization who was concerned about her oversight over her financial situation.
Right. Mm-hmm. So the African Institute refused because they would be partaking in the very thing they were objecting to.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's yes. Yes. Okay.
So it was very clever on Dunlop's part.
Oh, I didn't think about that. So he knew that was going to be their
Of course.
Shit.
Of course.
I'm never giving these dipshits the
because what Dunlop was saying was, what you are doing is paternalistic. I'm going to point that out to you.
God, that is really good.
Yeah.
Here's the point of the podcast where I remind our listeners, if this is your first time, I don't know the end of the story. I'm learning along with you. My favorite thing about this podcast is that Sovereign teaches me things. So I'm not feigning ignorance. I literally don't know how this goes.
So she had a right to sell herself. A person can enter such contracts as long as they are not treated as slaves under the service of the contracts. She had consented to her labor, while they couldn't address how impossible such consent is to give. Now, she was viewed as someone so fallen, she sold herself. The benefit is that it got her a written contract, a share of profits, and warmer clothes.
So what was the mission statement of the African Institute, and who were its actual members?
So the African Institute in England, also known as the African Institution, was a historical organization with a focus on promoting the study of Africa, improving conditions for Africans, and addressing issues related to the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. The African Institution was founded in 1807 in London, primarily in response to the passing of the Slave Trade Act of 1807 by the British Parliament, which abolished the British slave trade. The institution aimed to gather and disseminate knowledge about Africa, challenge negative stereotypes, and advocate for the end of slavery and the improvement of conditions for Africans. The organization had several prominent figures involved in its activities, including abolitionists and intellectuals such as Henry Brougham, William Wilberforce, and Thomas Clarkson. They sought to highlight the cultural, economic, and historical significance of Africa, challenge racist narratives, and promote understanding and cooperation between Britain and Africa. The African Institution conducted research, collected and published reports, and engaged in various activities related to Africa and the abolition of the slave trade. It supported exploration, sponsored expeditions, and sought to educate the public on African history, culture, and geography. However, over time, the African Institution faced criticism for its perceived paternalistic approach and its limited representation of African voices in its activities. It gradually declined in influence and was finally dissolved in 1827, with its activities and objectives largely taken up by other organizations and movements.
This created a new image for her. She was seen as a cunning businesswoman who outsmarted both her would-be exploiters and the abolitionists that wanted to send her to Bible school. She was now seen as wealthy and attracting potential suitors. One can see the benefits of her situation. There were the comforts of home to return to, but back in Cape Town or in her village, she was beset by white colonial rule, poverty, indentured servitude, and the violence of feuding Indigenous and Dutch groups. In London, she was safe, and she was well paid, and she was fucking famous, for now, at least. The aftermath. In the wake of the trial, Dunlop, who had still been on military payroll, was terminated. The governor of Cape Town had been made aware of Dunlop's ruse to get Sarah out of South Africa, and was deeply embarrassed that he'd been fooled. Dunlop and Caesar were entirely dependent on Sarah for their livelihood. The court trial had brought the show a lot of fame, though, and people got over the supposed prurience of the display, and so women were just as likely to attend. Sarah toured for the next 3 years across England, and then one day she showed up at a church and asked to be baptized. It's uncertain why she chose to be baptized, but it seems like something personal happened in her life, maybe a relationship. Oh God, relatable. She disappeared from public life, but continued to tour as the Hottentot Venus. In 1812, Dunlop died. He left anything he had to Sarah and Caesar. Since he was the guarantor of her contract, she lost any legal surety of return home. I would like you to explain what that means.
From what I gather, it's basically he was the person she had the contract with.
Right.
So when he dies, like now no one is legally obligated to make sure the terms of that contract are fulfilled. If you have a contract with someone and they die, if there's not someone stipulated to take on those obligations, there's no one that's now legally bound to guarantee the terms of your contract. He was the signee on the contract. So he was the one saying, you'll work this many years, you'll get this much money, and then you'll return home, right? And he dies.
Personally liable, there's no company.
Yeah, exactly.
No estate that she can take it to.
Yes,
Certainly
exactly.
Not as a Black woman during this time, a Black person and a woman at the same time during this time probably wasn't gonna like really win a lot of hearts and minds in civil jurisprudence.
She might have, given like her level of popularity and the public interest in her freedom. To me, what's more telling about this, because there's so much, she was enslaved, she was made to do this, she was made to do that. The fact that Dunlop left all of his belongings to her and Caesar, to me, speaks of a friendship. He could have left that to nieces, nephews, brothers, sisters. He didn't.
Devil's advocate, it also could have been something that he did out of a sense of guilt or a sense of like maybe he, again, we don't know, but if he felt like maybe some of this was maybe not the most ethical thing for him to be doing, it could be something where it's like you push that responsibility off till when you're dead and you're going to make sure your estate handles the things that you fucked up on. And I say that not out of pocket, but because this is the way I have seen things unfold where someone's being a real dipshit in their life, but they're fine because they are rich and they made sure that when they die, money benefits the people that they're not considerate of in their actual life.
I mean, I'm going to tell you that I think that there was some kind of a three-way relationship between these people. That's just my hoe instincts. I think that they were all partners in crime. And I think when Caesar like lifted the cane at her, I think that was a show, because I think the image they were trying to portray was that she was wild. She was wild, and she had to be controlled. And it didn't hit. It didn't land the way they wanted it to.
For the next 2 years, her and Caesar disappeared completely from public life. It's unsure exactly the nature of the relationship between the three. We have some ideas. That Dunlop had been friends with Caesar and not just a master was documented. They socialized together in Cape Town. But Sovereign also found newspaper accounts from the time during the trial where others gave testimony that Caesar had expressed fear of Dunlop as though he was a slave and not merely a servant.
In October 1810, in the Morning Chronicle, in a letter to the editor, a writer relayed this event with Henrik Caesar. That Caesar himself did actually attempt to explain to him one day when he met him on the staircase that both himself and the woman had been in a manner forcibly brought to this country where they were unhappy. It is what it is. But I will say this. They disappeared together for 2 years. Now, Henrik had a wife back home. Once Dunlop died and left them money, they could have just jumped on a boat right back home, but they didn't. It's uncertain what happened during the 2-year period between Caesar and Sarah. Perhaps they had an affair. Perhaps they intended to retire on the money they'd made and live together. Neither chose to return home at the time, nor did she perform. Then, in 1814, she reappeared with Caesar, who was using the alias Henry Taylor, which again, he had to use an alias because he had been legally barred from being in charge of Sarah. Again, back to that threatening her with the cane incident.
Yeah.
In 1814, they arrived in Paris. Caesar wrote to the Natural History Museum offering a preview of Sarah, an attraction for science. The board chose to ignore the letter, but she was a hit in Paris. She worked from noon to 6, then spent her evenings in bars and restaurants or at private parties. She perhaps worked as a courtesan. By all reports, she was much happier and more engaged in her performances after the death of Dunlop. Perhaps Dunlop's death was a blessing. Perhaps it was he and not Caesar that was the real tyrant in her life. There were rumors that she married in Paris, but there is no record of it. Clearly, people noticed a difference. I think there was probably like some kind of a love affair between her and Henrik Caesar, and that they probably ran out of money. By this point, she was an alcoholic, lots of partying and wild living. By all accounts, beforehand, she loved to hang out in the bars. She was a singer. She probably was engaged in sex work there too. We all know that girl, which is kind of what makes her legacy a little more complicated because people tend to want to put it in one group or the other. But having been a hoe, if you're looking at a situation where, well, you can return home and be an indentured servant and be a sex worker in the nightclubs and be scraping by, or you can be in Europe and you are making lots of money and you're partying with aristocrats and drinking champagne, I would probably want to stay in Paris. If I'm looking at what my choices are, this still would be the better choice. It's like the evil of two lessers. So,
and once again, it's very relatable because a lot of the time, people who reach out to sex workers, people reach out to us because they are in their heart of hearts sincerely concerned for us because they have lived and been brought up in some fucked ass religious propaganda shit where they truly believe narratives about us that are false and actually really harmful. And if you really, really want to get squirrely about it, in some cases, actually kind of stochastic terrorism, if we're being honest. These people who reach out to us, sure that they are going to be the ones that will turn us over onto a new leaf and save us from ourselves, are the ones who are expecting us to rejoice in leaving the lives we've built for ourselves. Even mediocre, kind of shitty being a sex worker is still way better than the servitude of marriage that the men who think that they're going to save us from sex work think that they're offering to marry us into. And it's uncanny how many men think that marrying us is like the thing. We've just been sitting on our laurels waiting for some boring mediocre man to marry us and let us have a life where we don't have to do this horrible horseshit anymore, and instead we can do something moral, like raise their children.
Well, I mean, they've been raised in the patriarchy where they genuinely believe that all women want is a husband and men's approval. They genuinely believe that that's like what we want. They don't understand that that's something that in the past we literally had to get in order to survive because we had been so oppressed by the institutions that kept us poor and helpless.
Just a quick reminder, when were women in America allowed to get credit cards?
The 70s?
I think it was the 70s.
You couldn't have your own bank account or your own credit score until the late 70s, the early 80s.
Thank you. Context.
So the show struggled in Paris. Caesar had to return to his wife and had yet to make his fortune, so he extended her performance hours. She was sick with exhaustion and recurrent flu, and she now was a big drinker, so she had begun to suffer from alcoholism-related illnesses. At some point, while Sarah was sick, Caesar sold the rights to her performances to a French showman named Rio and returned to his wife in Cape Town. She began to weep in public and drink more. I want to talk a little bit about Rio because people have said he held exotic animals, he put her in chains. There's no evidence he ever did any of that. Rio had been a ballet master in Cape Town in the African theater. Chances are these people all knew each other. He didn't just sell her to like a random, and he didn't sell her. It was the rights to her performances. She was a woman. She wasn't going to be allowed to have any kind of agency. She was going to have some dude in charge of her. And that had nothing to do with her blackness. That had to do with her being a woman. So he transferred the rights to her performances over to this guy, Ryu. And chances are she knew this guy because she was in the African theater. He had been a ballet master in the African theater. So chances are they knew each other. He was also just a very eccentric dude. So he did keep a lot of exotic animals, but there's no evidence that he ever kept her in a cage or had her in collar and leashes and chains and all of that kind of stuff. It's just, he was your average eccentric theater person. I think that her and Caesar had an affair. I think they had a relationship and that relationship broke down and he returned to his wife. And I think that's why she was crying. You know what I mean?
Timeline aligns very, very, very succinctly. Like,
yeah,
that is the most astute and direct observation to take away. It might be zebras, but it's probably horses. It probably
yes,
is.
exactly.
Yeah.
I think that they had a relationship with each other and that at some point she realized that he was literally just using her for the money. And then when she wasn't making the money, he left and went back to his wife. And she was probably really heartbroken by that. Okay, so it is not known how Caesar came to sell the rights to Ryu. But like I said, Ryu had spent many years in Cape Town as the ballet master of the African theater, the only theater in Cape Town.
What exactly was the African theater?
So during the 1800s, the term African theater in South Africa referred to theatrical performances and entertainment venues that catered specifically to African audiences. These theaters provided a platform for African performers and showcased theatrical productions that reflected the experiences, culture, and traditions of African communities. The African theater emerged as a response to the exclusion of African people from mainstream theaters, which were predominantly attended by European settlers and catered to their tastes and interests. African theater venues and performances provided an opportunity for African performers to showcase their talents and express their cultural identities through music, dance, storytelling, and dramatic performances. These theaters were often located in urban areas with significant African populations such as Cape Town, Johannesburg, and Durban. They played an essential role in fostering a sense of community, cultural expression, and entertainment for African audiences who were marginalized in other aspects of society. The performance in African theater encompassed a wide range of genres, including traditional African music and dance, folk tales, oral storytelling, and theatrical plays that tackled social issues and historical narratives relevant to African communities. The productions often incorporated elements of African languages, music instruments, costumes, and dance styles, celebrating African heritage and identity. The African theater was not without its challenges. Due to the racial segregation and discrimination prevalent during the colonial era, African theaters faced limited resources, inadequate funding, and censorship from colonial authorities, which is kind of how Ryu ended up back in France.
It's quite possible that Sarah performed for him while he worked there and while she was working for the dance halls and the theater there. Ryu was part of a crew of French-speaking men in the theater scene. Married to or involved with Black women, Ryu had been imprisoned for seditious behavior and deported back to Europe. Once in his possession, Sarah lived with Ryu in a menagerie of sorts that was his apartment. He collected exotic animals and used them in shows. He had Sarah working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. A fucking grueling schedule. I'm already mad about it, and I can't fucking believe that shit. Initially, the Museum of Man in Paris had no interest in exhibiting Sarah, but as her popularity grew, they expressed interest in booking her for 3 days to be sketched and studied for scientific purposes. The Natural History Museum finally wanted to get a look at Sarah, so Ryu arranged for her to pose as a life model for them for 3 days. His hope was that their report could bolster his promotional materials. Sarah refused to take off her clothes, and this subverted the scientist's mission to describe her in paintings and drawings, and ostensibly see if she had the elongated labia her people were rumored to have. After cajoling and attempts at bribery even, she agreed to pose nude, but to have a handkerchief to cover her vulva. This didn't stop the quote-unquote fucking scientists from trying to crawl all around her and get a look at her labia. The men became obsessed with her as an object. Shocking. The drawings of her to come from these 3 days of exploitation included imagined depictions of her vagina, exploded and enlarged next to her figure as a point of prurient scientific interest. So it's like, here's the model, and here's our whack-ass weird hyperfixation on what her genitals look like. Not just like what we think it might look like, but like extreme. Like,
and this just comes back to scientific racism, but also scientific sexism. It's too big to get into in this podcast. We'll do an episode just on that. The clitoris has been discovered 3 different times in history by anatomists. But it also shows like where Sarah's line was, which is that she was down for the theatrical presentation of herself, singing songs, dressed in her traditional regalia, being next to nude in the body stocking. But when it came time for her to be examined as a scientific oddity, she was not fucking having it, which is more why I think that she was very much a willing participant in being displayed, because I think she was a performer and I think she viewed it as performance. And it went part and parcel with a lifestyle. Whereas this being put up as a spectacle with scientists trying to crawl around her body to get a look at her vulva, for her, that was, no, I don't want to do this. So for me, I'm like, okay, I see where that line was. She was willing to be an exotic thing, but she was not willing to be a site of study.
Yes. And if you think about it, when she was performing, the people who were there mostly were people who were there because they were enthusiastic about her and were positive. It was probably an experience where she felt uplifted because she was doing something that she was creatively invested in. Whatever the performance is, you don't perform consistently if it's not something that you invest a little bit of yourself into.
Yeah.
And that is one thing. But a performance is an art. It's a craft. It's something that you're delivering to an audience. To simply be examined by scientists who are not treating you like a whole person, and especially a Black woman in this time. I can't imagine she was. Honestly, a Black woman in today's time doesn't have a great experience in medicine. So I can't imagine what this was like for her, because they weren't even seeing her as a person with dignity and respect that is inherent in having. She was an oddity to the point where she was a very passive noun to them and not anything like.
There's anecdotal stuff about doctors being taught even today that Black people have a higher pain tolerance. I believe that Black women in the United States have the highest mortality rate during labor and delivery.
Yes, the maternal death rate for Black women in America is fucking appalling.
Even Serena Williams was talking about having issues during labor and delivery and not being listened to until she was insisting. And that's Serena Williams. Arguably behind probably Beyonce or Oprah, like the most famous celebrated Black woman in the world. And even she was having trouble getting people to believe her when she was saying there's a problem here. And she wasn't being listened to. And it required a lot of insistence for it to happen. And one of the most famous celebrated Black women in the world, and is married to a billionaire. And in the moment of labor was unable to get people to listen to her and believe her when she was saying something is wrong. Things have not gotten much better is the short answer. So after she posed for these men, she got sick again. She was an alcoholic by this point, and she was ill often. The museum told Ryu that they would pay for her remains in the event of her death.
So they were like, we'll buy her corpse from you?
Yes.
They were like, hey, we'll buy that dead bitch's corpse from you.
Yes.
And like, we're not pretending to say it differently. We're saying it whole chest out loud in front of God and everyone.
Yeah. This took a very dark turn very quickly. She was now more valuable to Ryu dead than alive.
Jesus fucking Christ.
Less than 24 hours after her death, her body was in possession of the museum. Plaster casts were taken of her body, which were then used to make a wax figure of her likeness, which was then painted and dressed as she was on stage. The face of the figure is swollen and misshapen, attesting to how ill Sarah was at the time of her death. I did include in the notes the photos. There are photos of the wax image and things like that. It felt very macabre to include them because the disrespect of it all. Trigger warning, what follows is graphic. If you want to skip ahead 15 seconds, go ahead. I feel like it's important to say what happened because I feel like people need to understand how horrible this was. If we don't acknowledge what happened, I feel like that's more disrespectful.
100%.
Because we have to acknowledge that when you go to a museum and you see artifacts that were taken from Indigenous peoples and put on display, people need to understand and feel why that's so horrific, why it's morally reprehensible. So if you want, you can skip ahead 15 seconds. She was then dissected with her genitals and other organs put in jars of brandy. Her skeleton was then boiled and bleached and rearticulated. Okay, you can come back. We're through the bad part.
That was a very bad part.
I know. I know. It's horrible.
That fucking sucks. That's fuck.
It's horrible.
Jesus.
It's absolutely horrible. She was 24 years old when she died.
A 24-year-old woman was treated with less dignity and respect in her remains than, honestly, I've seen cooked chickens be treated with.
Like I said, I want people to understand when we talk about repatriating artifacts.
Yes.
This is what we're talking about. That artifact you're seeing on display was gotten through looting. It was gotten through colonization. It was gotten through genocides. It was gotten through unimaginable brutality visited upon people. And those things were taken. They were not given.
To this day, charging tourists to view them, or in some cases, charging tourists to come to museums where they're stored in a storage facility and not on display to justify the fact that they stole these things from the peoples who deserve to have them.
Here's the thing. They tried to stuff and taxidermy one human, an African man, and they couldn't get it to look realistic. That is the only reason that you weren't seeing people taxidermied and put on display. If in the 1800s, if they could have gotten them to look more lifelike, museums would have been filled with Indigenous peoples that had been colonized and conquered. Just some food for thought. The only thing that prevented them from literally just putting straight up taxidermied human beings,
antelope.
The only thing was that they've never been able to master that. That's how depraved it all is. If they could have, they would have. I think this goes around a lot of universities. When I was at university, there was a rumor that down in the basement, there was a taxidermied Native American. That was kind of an urban legend that went around. I think a lot of universities have kind of urban legends like that. Down in the basement of the university, in the anthropology department, they have this. And I think that comes from the fact that it was attempted at least once. I forget the name of the individual, but it was an African Indigenous person that they had tried to taxidermy and they couldn't get him to look lifelike enough. It was too disturbing for people to look at. The food for thought is that was literally the only thing keeping them from doing that to people.
They came so close.
So close.
Too disturbing for anyone to ever look at.
Yeah.
And they were just like, oh, poor craftsmanship, I guess.
Which is why they turned to the wax model. Madame Tussaud perfected that. The first wax model was actually Madame du Barry, who was one of Prince Louis's mistresses who was guillotined. And that was one of the first wax models. They made a death mask of her and then built a model from it and put a pump inside the chest so it would mimic breathing so that you could see what she looked like. Fun facts about Madame Tussaud.
Well, that's a thing I learned now, and I feel like that's a future episode of some sort.
Yes. Well, we will
one of these hoes.
We will definitely cover Madame du Barry. Sarah's likeness and skeleton were on display from the 1820s until the 1970s. To the 1970s. The 1970s.
150 fucking years.
Her skeleton and wax figure were put on display till the 1970s. We were into the 1970s before someone said, I think this is fucked up.
That's 150 years.
Yeah.
Of this woman.
150 years of like, look at this, look at this. Okay, so Sarah's likeness and skeleton were on display from the 1820s until the 1970s, when they were quietly tucked away, only to be rediscovered by Stephen Jay Gould in 1982. What ensued was a long and protracted battle to have Sarah's remains repatriated to South Africa. When Nelson Mandela was elected president of South Africa in 1994, he asked that Sarah's remains be repatriated from France. Nelson fucking Mandela
had some shit to say about her. And I don't remember many things Nelson Mandela had to say about particular women that I can draw from off the top of my head, but I feel like this is a very unique experience. And
so in 1994, he asked for her remains to be repatriated. In 1998, the United Nations declared the Khoisan a First Nation, strengthening their claim to her remains. The French were afraid that by returning Sarah's remains, they would be put into the position to return more and more artifacts from their collections.
Which they fucking should, because they don't own them and they should not have them in the first place.
Yeah.
And that is exactly what should happen to the collections that they have stolen from the people that they belong to. But go off.
Yeah.
France.
If you want to see South African artifacts, you should have to go to South Africa. Unless they're gifted, right?
True. If something is important enough to be in a museum, it should be in the museum in the country where it came from and where the individuals featured were from. In most cases.
Yeah.
Not all cases. I don't need anyone playing devil's advocate. I don't fucking care, and I don't want to hear you. This was fucked, and I'm glad someone recognized it.
Ultimately, in 2002, her remains were returned. She died in like 1810, around there. And it was like in 2002 is when her remains were finally returned to South Africa. So
2002?
2002.
I was a sophomore. No, maybe a junior. Sophomore to junior year of high school when she finally got to fucking go home.
Diana Ferris, a poet and activist, wrote a poem about Sarah that became emblematic of the movement to have Sarah's remains returned to South Africa. I thought it would be a good way to close out the episode to include that poem. So we're going to listen to it right now.
I've come to take you home. A tribute to Sarah Baartman. I've come to take you home. Home. Do you remember the veld? The lush green grass beneath the big oak trees? The air is cool there. And the sun does not burn. I have made your bed at the foot of the hill. Your blankets are covered in buchu and mint. The protea stand in yellow and white. And the water in the stream chuckles, sings songs as it hobbles along over little stones. I've come to wrench you away from the poking eyes of the man-made monster who lives in the dark with his clutches of imperialism, who dissects your body bit by bit, who likens your soul to that of Satan and declares himself the ultimate God. I've come to soothe your heavy heart. I offer my bosom to your weary soul. I will cover your face with the palms of my hands. Run my lips over the lines in your neck. Feast my eyes on the beauty of you, and I will sing for you. For I have come to bring you peace. I've come to take you home where the ancient mountains shout your name. I have made your bed at the foot of the hill. Your blankets are covered in buchu and mint. The protea stand in yellow and white. I've come to take you home where I will sing for you. For you have brought me peace. For you have brought us peace.
I've seen this video because I feel like in the early days when we were talking and planning things, this was one that I do remember seeing. Yeah. And I remember the first time I saw it, and every time I've seen it, maybe once in the interim and to now, it gives me the deepest fucking chills. And this woman who was speaking this poem to Sarah Baartman, and she's just, it's really fucking moving.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to say. It's incredibly moving to hear this woman who looks like someone who would be really fucking comfortable to hug and looks like she wants to hug the person she's speaking for. Like she's just so good. And
the reason that I like this podcast and like doing this every week is because history becomes kind of a monolith, but when you make it granular and you just tell one story, you're able to convey so much more because now it's a story, it's a person, it's real, right? And so Sarah Baartman is representative of millions of women's stories. If we're able to focus in and instead of saying we're going to take on the whole colonial project, if instead we say we're going to tell the story of Sarah Baartman as just one example of colonization and exploitation and chattel slavery and indentured servitude. We're going to pick this one and we're just going to talk about her and all the peculiarities and particularities of her life. Now we're able to feel something about facts and data so that by the time I started describing what they did to her body, it feels very uncomfortable. Now we're talking about someone we know. I want to be able to give the women that we're talking about depth and contours and meaning and emotional impact.
So what finally happened with her remains? Where is she now? Do what you will with what the consciousness does after death. That's not our purview.
So she was returned home and her remains were buried on Women's Day on the Eastern Cape. I'm not sure of the exact location, but near her home village. I included a picture. There's a monument. It's a little monolith with a placard describing the events of her life. I believe the poem might be included on the...
I don't know how to take an image that isn't in a Google Doc and just blow it all the way the fuck up.
Yeah.
I'm going to fuck First for a second because I'm actually super curious and I'd like to see it. Department of Arts and Culture and South African Heritage Resources Agency declaration of the burial site of Sarah Baartman as a National Heritage Site. I'm going to bring my little microphone over with me.
Yeah.
By virtue of the powers vested in the South African Heritage Resources Agency significance, the site has spiritual, cultural, social, and historical significance. The treatment of Sarah Baartman during her life and after her death speaks of suffering, dispossession, sadness, and loss of dignity, culture, community, language, and life. It is a symptom of the inhumanity of people. The return and burial of Sarah Baartman's remains in the region of her birth and motherland has brought closure to her life and restored dignity to her ancestors, and her living descendants. This site should serve as a symbol to all South Africans and the world to strive towards recognizing past injustices of the Khoisan people, to women, and to vulnerable communities, and to work towards building a nation that shows respect to human life, human rights, and human dignity.
Unveiled by the Honorable Minister of Arts and Culture, Dr. Z. Pallo Jordan, on March 7th, 2009.
I have to say, like, all things considered, it all sucks shit.
Yeah, it does. But
she was never given a chance. Like, she couldn't just fucking decide to roll with it and make the best of her circumstances. Some fuckers had to come in and, like, decide that she can't possibly... Like, the denial of agency to sex workers by people who claim to support or try to save us is...
Or just like to women in general, let alone Black women, potentially sex workers, indentured servants. This is a life by someone that was at the whims of men and is making the best of it. When I speculate on whether or not she was involved with Henrik Caesar, like, that's not meant in a disrespectful way, but it's also understanding human nature, which is that within constrained circumstances, it doesn't mean that people still might not have their emotional attachments and whatnot, even if it's just a matter of survival. I don't mean survival like eating food, but survival like emotional survival. Having to cling on to people that are abusive, having to imagine love where it does not exist to survive.
It feels like a very almost universal female experience, or femme-identified, or it doesn't matter where you're at. It's a tale as old as time, and it doesn't get any better with the next retelling or the next. I do really like that she was eventually, her remains were returned. If this was my friend who died, and we both have a lot of hers who have died that we loved.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying she's a hoe. I say things through the lens of being a hoe, not to imply that anyone else is, but because that's the life that I live.
Yeah.
I hate what her life consisted of. I hate how it should have been an incredible life of bounty and love with her partner who she married when she fell in love with that person before anybody could have taken her away from everything. But if shit happened and it went down the way it did, I at least appreciate that, like, literally somebody gives enough of a fuck to highlight how important she was on the ground, on the actual earth of her homeland.
That's what I wanted to talk about in this episode, is like why repatriation is so important. We walk through a museum and go, oh, that's so cool. But in many cases represents this level of inhumanity and brutality. It actually represents the worst of us. The cognitive dissonance that we have to go through to be like, museums, it's like where the best of everything is on display. And it's like a lot of times what you're looking at is the spoils of literally the worst of us.
Maybe it belongs amongst the people where it belongs. Maybe it belongs on the land where it came from and shouldn't have left that land in the fucking first place. Whether it's a human or an artifact, a mummy or fucking whatever. Like, the problem is that these things should never have been stolen from the people that they came from. And we shouldn't fucking do that shit. And putting it in a museum, even if we're putting cute like quotes around it, like, oh, well, this actually came from this and we learned better. If it exists in your museum and you have to apologize for it, just give it back.
Having said that, I've been coming to you from traditional Tongva and Chumash lands. So just out here in Los Angeles, just a shout out to the original inhabitants of the place that I'm sitting on and podcasting from, since we're on the subject of repatriation and colonialism and settlerism. Wanted to acknowledge that I am very grateful to be able to live in this city and experience the life that I do. Thank you to the stewardship that brought it here, which was from the Tongva and Chumash people.
And I, in the same vein, would like to acknowledge that I am recording on the lands that were originally the lands of the Tonkawa, the Apache, the Comanche, the Jumanos, and the, I'm going to fuck this one up because I'm very white and I apologize. Oh, also the Tonkawa. But you know what? I'm not going to fuck it up. It's Coahuitan. There's no way that I'm going to say it right. And there's every chance I'm going to say it in a way that's like not great. So
it's okay. Someone will write in and tell us how to say it.
There's always going to be someone.
Yeah. Someone will write in.
In this case, I very much appreciate it.
Oh yeah.
Please.
All notes accepted. Like, absolutely. Yeah. Like, hit us up on Twitter, on Instagram, and be like, hey, you got this wrong. Like, okay. Like, happy to.
You're probably, absolutely.
Yeah. Happy to correct it.
Doing the best that we fucking can, but yes, please collaborate, contribute.
Yeah.
But if you're a native or an indigenous person who can help me say that in a way that is respectful, this is a note we want to do every episode, and I'll make sure that we do it better the next time and the next time and the next time. But yeah. Also, we do this land acknowledgement to acknowledge that this land existed before white people came to it and colonized it, but also to acknowledge that Native people and Indigenous people are still very much alive. Their cultures still thrive.
Yes.
They are part of our society and our culture, and they're important. They're not a myth. They're not a, they're human beings, and they're still fucking here, and we're very grateful.
Yes. And also search the landfills. Search the fucking landfills.
Are we talking about for horror bodies or something else?
If you don't know what's going on in Canada right now, there was a serial killer that was preying on Indigenous women and has been apprehended and had, I don't like the words dump or dumping ground, so I say deposit and deposit site. but who was depositing the bodies of his victims in landfills, and the children of two of the women whose bodies have not been recovered have been asking for authorities to search the landfills. It has become a huge movement. The government seems to think that it's okay for those landfills to simply become the final resting place. I don't know how I would lose my mind if someone said that it was acceptable for one of my loved ones' gravesite to be a landfill, a literal garbage dump.
Fucking trash.
So there is a hashtag movement going on across social media right now, which is search the landfills, which it's a demand for the government to search the landfills for the bodies of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Indigenous women face the highest rates of gendered violence in North America. And it's a problem. And it's a problem we need to start taking very seriously. This is a show by hoes about hoes and hoe adjacent women. And this is the stuff we're going to talk about. Is not only is there historical context for what we're talking about, but the reason we're talking about this stuff is because it's still going on. It's still happening today. Sources for this episode were African Queen, The Real Life of the Hottentot Venus by Rachel Holmes, From the Venus Sickness to the Hottentot Venus by Mansell Upham. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Wikipedia, Hottentot. And then blackpast.org, Global African History, Sarah Baartman. And the documentary on YouTube. I have linked all of those. The links to all of those articles will be in the show notes. Today's episode was hosted by me, Sovereign Sire, and Miss Ella Darling. The episode was written by me, Sovereign Sire, and produced by Joshua Anderson. Please make sure to go rate us 5 stars and leave a nice, shiny review. Those things absolutely help boost our numbers and help the algorithm get us where we can be seen, because obviously the idea is to get these stories as far and wide as possible. Okay, and that's Sarah Baartman. So
thank you so much, Sovereign.
Thank you.
Thanks
I love you. I love you. Okay.